on this. Oh, did you hear that?
I
Scary.
did, yeah.
View speaker. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for allowing me the opportunity, excuse me, allowing me the opportunity to visit some precious things that stem very substantially, not so much from my multi-university experience, but from the time which Katie and I had the privilege of spending in Geneva, from which we learned a very great deal. And I have on my desk the Swiss flag to remind me of what my priorities are so far as today is concerned. So I hope that I can share my screen. Let's see if we can do it. Whoa, it seems to work. There we are. And I hope you can all see that.
Yes, it's very clear, Peter.
Good. I'm not sure that the title shouldn't be The Red Cross, the Franco-Prussian War and Switzerland, but never mind. Let's see how it pans out. A more interesting visual representation of the title is that because I want to convey the sense throughout this talk that the relationship between the Swiss state, the Swiss federal state, and the Red Cross is very close. There's no accident whatsoever that the Red Cross flag, the first one you see on your left, is the obverse of the Swiss flag, which you see there. That isn't to say that it stands for everything against what is Swiss. It's quite reverse. It saw itself in the design of its flag, including the squareness, which is unique to national flags that the Swiss have selected over a long time. And so there is an identity between the Red Cross movement worldwide and its Swiss origins. And I just want to explore how that came about and some of the ramifications. As I said, we lived in Geneva, and for much of my working time there, I spent in and out of the headquarters of the United Nations with these magnificent parade of flags on a really windy day. It's really quite magnificent with them energetically flapping in their multicolored ways. It's always slightly something of an irony that the building of the United Nations headquarters in Geneva is one of the most severe versions of German Nazi architecture, very Third Reich in its ambition, in the cleanliness of its lines, and in the materials from which it is constructed. Quite a visual contrast to always what was and what needs to be put right and what must not ever happen again. And certainly I gave my heart to the whole enterprise of the United Nations in Geneva, because whilst the United Nations headquarters in New York is about power and those who administer and demonstrate power and withhold power from others, Geneva, headquarters of the United Nations, is always about the powerless, whether they be refugees, whether they are hungry, whether they are ill, whatever it might be. United Nations Geneva stands for those in the world who are without power, without the political support that they need to give them a decent life. There's an awful lot that's wrong with United Nations Geneva, but we should never forget that that is its aim, that's what it stands for. And it begins really with Henri Dunant, who established Geneva as a place where serious negotiation can take place. And what inspired him was the entirely negative experience that he had when, as a gentleman and businessman, he visited the Battle of Solferino in 1859. So a one-day battle, which in the end saw Austria losing many of its possessions in what is now Italy. And what appalled him was the terrible condition that he found the soldiers on both sides, hungry, injured, dying, and no one to support them. And what really appalled him was the fact that this was happening just 3 years after the end of the Crimean War, which historically has become famous through Florence Nightingale and others for the way in which battlefield medicine was beginning to make a mark. But at Solferino, there was none of that in evidence. And it was that led Henri Dunant to inspire what became the creation of the Red Cross, to establish Geneva as a location for mediation, moderation, negotiation. And out of that process came the first Geneva Convention of the 1860s, and the beginnings of the Red Cross, at which point I'm sorry to report that he fell out with almost absolutely everybody and disappeared largely from view. The Red Cross was then established. All kinds of very good things happened in Geneva, not least the rapprochement between the United Kingdom and the United States, Great Britain, I should say, and the United States over the Alabama claims that have been left over from the American Civil War, all sorts of things that consolidated Geneva as a center. But Henri Dunant had almost nothing to do with those subsequent events. What he was mostly responsible for was the foundational ideas. This is a rare photograph of one part of the battlefield. This is of Solferino. This is the Italian camp just a day before the battle took place. As is indicated in the list underneath, it's a variety of nations claim different ways of describing this particular battle, but it was historically, in a small way, it's significant in that it was the last time in European history where the three combatants, Italy, France, and Austria, were commanded by their respective crowned heads, known as 1, 2, 3. Franz Joseph of Austria, King Emmanuel II of Italy, and Napoleon III of France. Ever since then, and probably very wisely, crowned heads have opted not to command their troops in battle. Here's a painting of Napoleon III looking over the battlefield, very much hoping that his career will have the kind of studded glory of his namesake Napoleon I. But it's this picture which is celebrated in the Red Cross. This is a picture of the aftermath of the battle, of the terrible suffering of the soldiers, and Henri Dunant galloping in sheer horror and amazement that human beings could do these sorts of things to each other. That's him supposedly on the white horse. We always imagine that battles leave decent things, but the tradition of the things of the Commonwealth War Graves tradition and the Second World War and the First World War's honouring of war dead in proper named cemeteries and so on didn't exist until sometime after Solferino, and all that you can find on the battlefield of Solferino now is this ossuary which just collects together in more or less artistic arrangements the remnants of the soldiers who lost their lives, many of them, as Henri Dunant would want us to remember, entirely needlessly, not so much because there's no need for war, but if you have got war and you have combat, you will have people who will die of their wounds if it's not properly treated. And so out of the Battle of Solferino, Jean-Henri Dunant, to give him his full name, though he only ever was known as Henri, in 1862 published a memoir of the war. And out of that memoir came two great ideas whose relevance will never be exhausted, but were new at the time. The first one was that there is an absolute need in time of battle and war for a permanent relief agency that operates internationally, that can provide humanitarian aid in wartime. And humanitarian aid involves things obvious like medical facilities, burial facilities, the cherishing of those who've been taken prisoner in combat, providing them with adequate support, and in particular, giving them the opportunity to connect with their families at home, from whom they would otherwise be entirely unconnected. The postal services that the Red Cross organized were immensely important as part of that humanitarian aid. So, not like the Korean War, where there was a need to create a battlefield military institution. Here he was saying we need a permanent relief agency that can move at a moment's notice wherever in Europe, because they were only thinking about Europe, to help in the case of war. The second idea is that the first idea won't work unless it is internationally guaranteed. A variety of governments, as many as possible, need to be aware that such an agency, which is in everybody's interest, needs to have a neutral status, a guaranteed neutral status, complete impartiality, which would give it access to war zones to provide aid and relief. That means that the Permanent Relief Agency is not free to choose sides between good or evil or almost good and somewhat bad. It has to be genuinely neutral. Jenny was asking us earlier to support the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. That's the sort of thing which an international permanent relief agency simply cannot do. That's choosing sides, that's being partisan, and that's not what a humanitarian agency that Henri Dunant had in mind. Simply can't do that. And those two ideas are fundamental to the establishment of the Red Cross. And happily, although Henri Dunant himself rather dropped out of everybody's favor, he wasn't an easy man to deal with. He was a brilliant ideas man, but not someone who could build an institution. But he was the recipient late on in life of the very first Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize, along with the Literature Prize, is historically very controversial, but I don't think anybody since 1901 or 1902, whenever he was given that first prize, I don't think anybody would question Henri Dunant's important role excuse me, in enabling the international community to think more constructively, creatively about warfare and what needs to be taken into account given the disastrousness of the consequences for almost everybody involved. So that's, as it were, where we get to with the signing in 1864 of the Geneva Convention, which acknowledges, only 12 countries originally signed it. We'll come to that list in a moment, but they virtually guaranteed the ideas that Dunant had. There would be a permanent established international agency, and its neutrality would be guaranteed, and its access to the battlefield, the very front line, to provide humanitarian aid would be guaranteed by the belligerents on condition that the international agency took no sides. that was an inspiring idea. And across Europe, from Portugal to Russia, Scotland to Italy, very quickly relief societies sprang up, inspired by the idea that just as the Battle of Solferino had followed only a few years after the end of the Crimean War, the chances were that yet again European nations would go to war, and there was a need to provide some sort of assistance. And this was quite a popular, I was going to say uprising, that's not quite what I mean, but an enthusiasm was developed for this across Europe. And most countries were involved. And when it came to the actual war between France and Germany, the respective Red Crosses, if we can call them that by then, of France and Germany were quite impartial as to who they provided help to. There's plenty of evidence. I'm just going to just take a sip of tea. The French and the German Red Crosses, respectively, were entirely happy in treating the wounded, the prisoners of the other side. And alongside them, this group of countries, which were the original signatories of the 1864 Red Cross Convention, they flooded over with money, with nurses, with doctors, with transportation to help in the front line or not far from the front line. Most of these were, as it were, sponsored by their respective governments, but largely financed from voluntary contributions. So in the case of the United Kingdom, we didn't call it the British Red Cross just yet. I think that happened in the 1890s, I think. But from the time that Britain signed the Geneva Convention, the first Geneva Convention, established was the British National Society for Aid and the Sick and Wounded in War. And this is a picture of not inconsiderable energy going in to provide medical equipment to be taken as quickly as possible to the front line. As you can see there, by September 1870, so not really long after the war had started, an astonishing amount of money had been raised from the British public. And a really amazing amount of money, which was distributed by the British National Society equally to both sides. Robert Lloyd Lindsay, in fact, was a man who, at the outbreak of war, wrote a famous letter to the Times suggesting that Britain should establish a British National Society. And the main purpose of his letter, interestingly, was that it was time for Britain to catch up with the rest of Europe. Almost all of the other in the list that I'd given you already had their aid societies. Britain, as in so many ways, lagged behind. And his letter to the Times kick-started the British effort. And he was the chair of the British National Society and was president of the British Red Cross for almost 25 years, I think. And here's a picture of him allegedly moving across between the French lines and the Prussian lines, distributing financial aid to each. So he had a retinue carrying gold and other financial effects, distributing it equally between the French and the German side. So we were late to, as it were, to appear, but we got there, as it were, in the end. And of course, the British Red Cross has been busy in two world wars and ever since. But the origin of that is Henri Dunant, and in our particular case, a retired colonel who had himself seen battlefield fighting in the Crimean War. So once again, you have, as it were, a connection between the recent memory of war and its consequences in the form of Lloyd Lindsay, who was subsequently ennobled for his great work and became Lord Wantage of something or other in due course. The immediate past research department head at the Henri Dunant Institute published something which I've always rather treasured, saying, as you can see there, that the Red Cross has not defeated war. The Red Cross people always knew that war would go on, but I like that second sentence. But since 1870, it is engaged in a fierce struggle with war. It rescues war's victims. And even on the battlefield itself, it protects man against man. It has taken up the cause of life. That looks rather idealistic now, in that the third sentence, it rescues war's victims, was, of course, at the time largely restricted to competence, men in uniform. The job of the Red Cross is now infinitely greater, because in very recent times, and we've all lived through them, the Russian war, urban warfare in Grozny, Pakistan defeating its insurgents in the Northwest Territories, the Sri Lankan attack and the defeat of the Tamil Tigers, the way Syria, together with Russia, attacked those who were protesting against the regime, and more recently, of course, in Gaza, we see a ruthless use by government of military power against what is known to be innocent civilians. And in the case of Grozny, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Syria, from the point of view of the regimes involved, it has worked. And the international community has shame on its hands in that in none of those cases has the participating belligerent power been in any way punished for its attack on civilians. And the Red Cross, therefore, has taken on a much, much more serious range of challenges than ever Henri Dunant thought would be the outcome of his experience at Solferino. Let me move to the second part of what I want to say. There are only two parts, you'll be pleased to know. And that's to talk a little bit about the Franco-Prussian War itself, otherwise known as the Third War of German Unification, or if you are biased and rooted in Second World War things, sometimes called the Third War of German Expansion. I think it's best thought of as part of, to use A.J.P. Taylor's masterly phrase, the struggle for mastery of Europe, which has been largely a matter of France and the Germanic peoples in a variety of formations over hundreds of years. And in our particular subject, we're talking about the rise of Prussia since its catastrophic defeat at the hands of Napoleon I at the Battle of Jena in 1806. How was it, the Prussians asked themselves, that the finest, most professional army in the world could be defeated by a ragtag mob of conscripted soldiers from France. How could that possibly be? And it led the Prussians to rethink the nature of their state, and in particular, the nature of their military. And that's where, in my own personal terms, professional terms, I should say, that's where military training and education in modern times really starts, with the way in which the Prussians respond to defeat in order that defeat should never again be visited upon the Prussian state. And of course, it was a huge success story stretching over decades. And in the course of it, under Wilhelm I and Prince Otto von Bismarck, Prussia gradually expanded by defeating Denmark and acquiring Schleswig-Holstein, defeating Austria, preventing other kinds of expansion. In both of those cases, the two adversaries were isolated, and they had no allies anywhere, and so they were quite quickly defeated. And the same thing happened in 1870-71. France was isolated, defeated quickly, and humiliated, and with the result, Germany could be unified at last, as its proponents would suggest, under Prussian leadership. So out of the war, just not many months in duration, the German Empire is announced cruelly at Versailles. So in Louis XIV's most favorite room, the Hall of Mirrors, the German Empire is proclaimed with not a French man or woman or child in sight. A real humiliation for the greatness of France that such an event should happen in its greatest palace. And this is a very evocative painting showing the tributes being paid to Kaiser Wilhelm, who is this figure here, of course, but the most important figure is the one right in the center in his white jacket and leather boots, standing very proudly at the center, Prince Otto von Bismarck, who had engineered this particular moment of Prussian triumph. So what we're dealing with is the war that led to that outcome. So how did it start? This is what Europe looked like at around the time when the war started. There's no need to go into, excuse me, details of how, but and there are many historians who would argue whether France started it or whether Prussia started it. It doesn't really matter from our point of view. It ended up with France declaring war on Prussia. Very quickly, Prussia, together with significant German allies, Germany is not yet unified, as you can see there. And quite quickly, France is on the losing side. Here is a map of northeastern France. The red line shows the degree of advance of Prussian and German troops by the end of November. You can see how deeply they've already moved into France, and most particularly Paris, although not yet perhaps surrendered, it is besieged and it will fall. And by the end of November, Napoleon III has been deprived of his freedom. He's under a Prussian arrest. He's a prisoner of war. He's given some dignified small schloss in Germany to live in as a prisoner of war before eventually finding elegant retirement in the south of England. As you probably all know, he's buried with his wife, Sophie, in St. Michael's Convent in Farnborough. But if you watch the red line, you'll see what happens after November. Prussian and German advances continue. And you can imagine in that setting, the months have passed since the early days of the war. So this whole area, in particular the front line, but also in the rear area where there are lots of French prisoners of war being held on French soil. There are German prisoners of war being held on French soil. This whole area isn't just militarized, as it were, by German-Prussian activity. It's also full of those 12 nations providing military support, being responsible for, in some cases, prisoner of war camps, seeking to provide such humanitarian aid as it was possible to be. So it's wrong to think of the battlefield or France at that time as being just Germans and French people. In fact, the place is full of people with money, with medical equipment, moving railway cars, bringing cartloads of food, all sorts of things that are happening to try and ameliorate the effect of combat. And if we move to the bottom right, which is where we're going, you'll see almost the last part of the war. General Bourbaki created an army out of the remnants of the army Lust. And he was tasked to relieve the French fortress at Belfort there. On the way, he is largely troubled by a battle that he has with the Prussians there. He fails to relieve Belfort and escapes with his ragtag and bobtail army in dreadful defeat. They've lost control of their food. They've lost control of command. It's ill-disciplined, very little leadership. And Bourbaki himself attempts to commit suicide. He actually shoots himself in the head, but fails to kill himself. So he is then obviously replaced. And almost the entirety of his army is surrounded at a small town of Pontarlier. And they just about managed to escape. And when I say they, I'm talking 90,000 men. 90,000 men are almost corralled here, but they escape to the only place that they can, and that is to cross the border into Switzerland. And that leads really to the modern role of the Red Cross, seeking to provide absolutely objective help to whatever comes their way. And sometimes it's very controversial. As you can see, these are very contemporary photographs from Israel, blaming the ICRC for not having saved the hostages that are still being held in Gaza. Everything that the Red Cross does, almost ever since that escape of the French army into Switzerland, is well described as a delicate role. And goodness me, with such grace have the Swiss carried it out. And here is a painting by Edouard Castres, who is a Geneva artist who had learned his trade in Geneva, but went to Paris to learn from all of the wonderful things that were going on in French art at the time. And he, along with many others, was one of the people who worked for the French Red Cross. And so he very quickly was deployed and found himself with Bourbaki's army, and is the man who has given us these images, which we assume are as accurate as we can hope them to be. Ironically, even though it's 1870, so 5-6 years after the end of the American Civil War, which is widely photographed and sometimes quite wonderfully photographed, there are hardly any photographs of this particular war. They're certainly not online. They may be in museums, military museums on the continent, but they've certainly not been released for our delectation and education. So we're relying on Edward Castra, as will become clear in a moment. So Bourbaki's army passes into Switzerland at more or less that point. It's a dreadful scene. Here are, thanks to our painter guy, is an image of the two generals, the Frenchman on the left, asking for asylum, and Herzog accepts on the clear understanding that a firm agreement is reached. You can still see that in the archives in Bern, and above all French soldiers must be disarmed immediately. And this is one of Edward's paintings showing the laying down of weapons at the Swiss border. It was on condition that the French army disbanded and disarmed is what I mean, not disbanded, that the Prussians did not chase them into Switzerland. The Bourbaki's army was terrified that it would be massacred. Once it was disarmed, almost immediately, the Prussians backed off, and that was the end of the matter, leaving things in the hands of the Swiss. What was to be done with them? Well, this is the place where Katie and I have visited. We've been to Les Verrières, which is on the border. It's a very nice place, rather flat in the sort of foothills of the Jura Mountains. The border between Switzerland and France is not a spectacular place. There is no signs up saying border force or refugees not welcome and all of those things that we celebrate. But if you take Edouard Sacré's the painting, you'll see the similarity. You see the tree line on that painting, and in real life, you can see recognizably his wish to be as accurate as he can be in representation. And that's a picture of the train ambulances taking the worst wounded and taking them into Geneva and to other hospitals in Lausanne and into Zurich as quickly as possible from what amounted to the front line. And so Swiss succor was immediately and most generously offered to these now disarmed soldiers. And what is really significant is how the Swiss then dealt with those soldiers. Here's a photograph of a particular group of them in a tiny village on the eastern side of Switzerland. And that is just symptomatic of what the Swiss did. They suddenly had 90,000 new people to feed, clothe, and look after, possibly indefinitely. And the way they chose to do that, led by the International Committee of the Red Cross, was to distribute those prisoners, those detainees, across the whole of Switzerland. There's hardly a village in Switzerland that was not hosting a French soldier or more. Some were bivouacked in churches, some in schools, some in makeshift halls like the one that's represented here. And a vast number were living in ordinary Swiss people's homes. And the idea behind this act of generosity was, of course, partly political and definitely intentional by the leadership of the Red Cross. And that was to inculcate across Switzerland the sense in which Switzerland was different, that when it declared itself to be neutral, it meant it was impartial, it would play no part in war, but it would do its best to be hospitable and generous in the cause of peace and prosperity. Swiss aren't interested just in peace. It's got to be peace and prosperity. And that really changed Switzerland. It was one of the latter day unifying forces in Swiss history. For any of you who know anything about the Swiss will know that it's divided into cantons. And if you speak to a Swiss person, they will tell you what canton they came from before they tell you that they're Swiss, or which city or which village they came from. Cantonal loyalty is fierce, and getting over cantonal barriers and rivalries and institutional habits and so on is one of the tasks of nation building in Switzerland. And this effort led by the Red Cross to spread French prisoners across and share that experience as being a different kind of nation state to all others in Europe certainly worked and had that effect on the polity of Switzerland. Amongst the many things that they did, for example, was to provide a free postal service for every one of those soldiers so that they very quickly could be back in touch with their families back home, as quick as the French postal service would allow, of course, but made sure that those at home could write back to their men who were prisoners. So quite a remarkable national effort. And it didn't take long for Geneva to realize that this was so transformational, so significant, that it wanted a permanent record of it. And so it built this rotunda in which to create a panorama of the surrender of French arms on Swiss soil. And it's now in another location. It's been relocated to Lucerne, but it's just the same as before. And our artist friend is the one who was put in charge of creating it. And it's partly statuettes, but associated too with painting as well. So you can see here where the join is between the 3 dimensions and the 2 dimensions. And here is an image of the actual rifles, some of them that were deposited by the French soldiers in 1871 with piles that are painted. It's a very realistic thing to see, and Katie and I loved being there. But as it were, the dominant image that one remembers is captured in pictures like this, where the provision of transport and medical assistance is being provided in a disciplined way. You can see that the people associated are already wearing the Red Cross, and this is where the modern Red Cross is born. It's born on the battlefield and is reinforced by the plurality of Swiss positive support for this kind of effort. Because so much of that took place in French-speaking Switzerland, the decision was taken that rotunda that I showed you in Geneva should be moved to German-speaking Switzerland, so that German Swiss would also feel, as it were, part of this story. The way of passing on generation after generation of what it was that the Swiss do and did in time of war, and that generosity and hospitality are what they are about. That needed to be something more than just in the unfashionable western part of Switzerland, where a few people speak French, but they're not really Swiss, if you're from Zurich, for example. And so by putting it in Lucerne, they put it into the middle of Switzerland geographically, so that this message, as it were, could go out and be sustained year on year for as long as necessary. And just to conclude, today, Switzerland, being one of the most reluctant members of the United Nations, is now on the rotational part of the Security Council. And on its government website, you can see how they, as it were, play with the flag, turning into a plus sign, which converts into the dove of peace. The image, therefore, that was created back in the 1870s and sustained through the 70s and 80s into the, as it were, the outlook of the Swiss people as a whole, as a unifying force, continues to be enormously powerful. And one can see it in latter times in this remarkable sculpture, which is in Geneva. This is a chair that was commissioned during the time when the United Nations in Geneva was negotiating the landmine treaty, which was a very difficult thing to negotiate, and which was a great success in terms of Geneva's moral authority. And this chair was commissioned from an artist to stand exactly opposite that long line of flags that I showed you, so that it was unmistakable. And of course, as a visual metaphor for the damage which landmines do, you couldn't better that. And of course, because it's a not particularly beautiful piece of sculpture, the City Council of Geneva, the moment the landmine treaty was signed, began dismantling it. And there were near riots in Geneva. They insisted that this was part of what Switzerland has been since the 1870s, that although the landmine treaty had been signed, that's a perfect metaphor for what Geneva stands for, trying to put things right. And so that sort of popular sense that gave rise to the response to Henri Dunant, that sustained the French prisoners through the months of their incarceration in Switzerland, which sustains the Red Cross movement across the world, even in these greatly more difficult times than were ever envisaged. One can still sense in the protest that this chair must stand is evidence of the extent to which the identity between the Red Cross movement and the Swiss state still exist. And I think it's just wonderful that you've got on the one end of that photograph the Geneva United Nations headquarters, and at the other end of the flags you've got this standing sculptural reminder of the cruelty that we do to each other and the necessity of the United Nations being the agency, if not to bring it to an end, to lessen its impact and to reduce its incident. Thank you very much.
Well, Peter, as perhaps expected, it wasn't just engaging, but it was also very thoughtful and informative, knowledgeable, and delivered with an element of humour almost, although it's quite difficult to sometimes to smile through these very, very important subjects. Do you want to fill up your teacup first, Peter, or are you immediately open to questions?
I'm looking at the clock. I apologise for speaking for too long.
As I said, there's no such thing as too long, Peter. It's
no, that was
even 2 minutes can be too long if it's boring.
Anyway.
So the floor is open for questions, if that's okay, Peter. Yes. Okay, good. Either raise your hand physically or raise the hand at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then hopefully I can pick up if someone wants to ask a question. Phil, go ahead. Take yourself off mute. Can you find it?
You could probably control it, actually.
No, that's the one thing I
It's
do.
off.
There you
Yeah,
go. Go for it.
Off you go, Phil.
Right. Thank you very much, Peter. Very interesting. What do you know of the relationship between Hamas Medical as the health committee that give the almost daily casualty mortality rates and the Red Cross? I don't seem to remember much about the Red Cross in the Gaza situation.
I mean, the first thing to say is that the Red Cross will be focused primarily on those who are suffering. And it doesn't help that Hamas is a belligerent power and happens to run the hospitals. This makes things extremely difficult for the Red Cross, because if it is seen, and this is where it's delicate, if it is seen to identify with Hamas or do Hamas's job for it or whatever it might be, the ICRC's negotiating power with Jerusalem will be nil. And the Red Cross has no function if it voluntarily gives up its negotiating ability with both sides. Therefore, it's very often the case, and I'm sure it's the case now, that people will not be getting as much Red Cross help as they might otherwise because of the role of Hamas in this war. In almost every conflict that the Red Cross is involved, it is hit from all sides about not doing its job properly. And usually that is an indication that it's doing its job very well. But it is an awkward, a complex, and morally difficult position to take. But if the purpose of the Red Cross is as its founding fathers wanted, and as the international treaty which led to its creation in 1864 means anything, it has to be neutral and not take sides. And we need an organization that can do that and has the moral courage, as it were, to be in that situation. I'm always amazed, I have been amazed in my dealings with the Red Cross, which have been only in the matter of very lightweight discussions compared to what we're talking about now. Some of the very best people in Switzerland find their way to leadership roles in the Red Cross. It's almost as though the sheer challenge of what it is to be independent and neutral brings out the very best of those people who have the ability to lead it. And therefore, my respect for the Red Cross is bottomless, really. People who, I mean, I have a tremendous respect for people who put themselves in positions of danger and so on, be that medical people working in infectious diseases, be it in the intelligence world, or whether it's fire crews or whatever it might be. But usually those people at least expect to be thanked at some point for what they've done. Red Cross is very rarely thanked for anything. Thank you.
Thanks. Bruce, go ahead.
I did a little bit of reading, and the Franco-Prussian War is almost as difficult to understand why it started as the First World War. But talking about the humanitarian situation, basically, when the Prussians had basically almost won militarily, they couldn't get the Parisians to surrender, and they laid siege to Paris. The rich people found food. They even killed the zoo animals. But the poor people Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that some of them died of the famine. And how do how it's a bit similar to what's going on in the wars around the world now.
Mm.
How can the Red Cross actually cope with that when you've got a belligerent trying to get the defeated people in Paris to surrender, and they won't? And so there must have been illness. It was right in the middle of winter. I mean, it was a very strange time to fight a war. So
I do not know the answer to the specific question which you're answering, which you're asking, which is a very good question indeed, Bruce. It must have been the case during that siege that the Prussians let the Red Cross, the humanitarian institutions from the various countries into Paris. So there must have been some flow of medical and humanitarian aid. But as you say, there was starvation. And after the war, that's when you get the Paris Commune, which for many on the left would be seen as, a magnificent and courageous attempt to reorder society and break with its hierarchical past, and certainly a very important event from the point of view of the evolution of Marxist-Leninism and the international movement generally at the end of the 19th century. So that comes out of the suffering that you're referring to, and the fact that the Red Cross was not able to ameliorate to any great extent. And I'm sure that that's linked with the point that Phil's made. The Red Cross will have limitations as to what it can do to help the suffering in Gaza. I mean, when we're talking about millions of people who have no home, no water, no food, and the military attacks continuing, that I simply don't know what plans the Red Cross must have to deal with that sort of thing. But you raise a very good point, and I would like to follow that up in due course. Next one.
And also the great.
Sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
The great tragedy then, with what were the remnants of the defeated army in basically a civil war, that they probably killed as many left-wing French people in the Commune as they'd killed Prussians during the war. I mean, they killed over 40,000 people. It was.
I'm conscious of that.
The horrors of war are just beyond my understanding.
Yeah. You share that view, Bruce, with 7 billion other people. So don't feel you're alone.
Pam.
Yes, just a brief question, skipping back to the question about the role of the Red Cross. I wondered whether, particularly in the present situation in Gaza, where the Red Crescent fits into the picture you were sketching.
Yeah. I mean, they work hand in glove together. I mean, it is necessary in a Muslim society not to carry crosses everywhere. That doesn't. That is to become biased. That's taking sides straight away as far as the host nation are concerned. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, when it puts people into the field, is itself acting as the Red Crescent as well. Indeed, there are versions of the logo with the Star of David, and there are other versions as well. It isn't as though they are separate organizations. They will have separate arms and things of that sort. But ultimately, they all respond to the International Committee of the Red Cross sitting in Geneva.
And that's an important and interesting thing in itself.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Takes some skill.
Yeah, I think the Star of David version is called the Red Crystal.
Don't know. Not heard that phrase myself.
Oh, right. Yeah. As in Kristallnacht, I think, is the origin of that. Karen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. I was just wondering how independent the Red Cross is now. Is it still dependent in any way on the neutrality and generosity of Switzerland and Swiss people?
The first thing to say is that the Red Cross is a federation as an organization. so that there is a French Red Cross, there's a British Red Cross, and so on. And Katie's brother, for example, worked for the British Red Cross in Kenya and other parts of Africa for a long time. So part of what the Red Cross does is under national auspices, but seeks to follow transnational, international, neutral guidelines. I mean, Katie's brother, for example, was responsible, if that's the word, for Somalia. How anybody can be responsible for Somalia, I have no idea. But he was responsible for directing Red Cross effort into that beleaguered civil war ravaged nation. And that wasn't being managed from Geneva, that was being managed from Kenya through the British Red Cross. So in that sense, one has to distinguish between the national arms that carry out Red Cross tasks and the Geneva Centre of that. And in terms of the Geneva Centre, that is wholly Swiss. There are often arguments that Switzerland should widen the recruiting base for senior posts in the Red Cross. But the answer to that otherwise perfectly good challenge is always the same. For as long as it is Switzerland, the people are Swiss, and the national policy guaranteed by the Federal Council is that of neutrality as defined in the Swiss Constitution. That is the best guarantee of true independence for the International Committee of the Red Cross and the movement as a whole. So there may be elements of the Red Cross under national auspices that are not, quote, as pure as other areas, but there is a distinction to be made. And if there was a criticism about quasi-independence or not true neutrality or some taking of sides and of this, it would be via national agencies rather under the Red Cross flag rather than the Swiss central command structure.
Okay. Peter, you're clearly in admiration of the Red Cross, how it operates, how it started, and therefore by implication, well done. You're also in admiration of the Swiss approach, I would suggest, to proactive peacemaking.
Yeah.
My question is, do you sometimes wistfully think that wouldn't it be wonderful if the UK took the same approach to proactive peacemaking?
Switzerland is made up of many cantons with a history of rivalry and going back to medieval times, warfare. I mean, after all, Swiss mercenaries were amongst the most fearsome military organizations out for hire in European history. But that structure of semi-hostile cantons sometimes was referred to, isn't that rather like Bosnia and former Yugoslavia? If it works for Switzerland, why can't it work for Bosnia, Herzegovina and Serbia and so on? To which the answer that is usually given, Sjoerd, is, but they're not Swiss. And we're not Swiss. We have one of the most belligerent histories in modern times.
Yes.
The peace movement has no institutional structure, as it were. It doesn't have popular media or any kind of support. It's kept alive by believing citizens who think it could be otherwise. But when the next occasion arises about Britain deploying aircraft, for example, as currently to the Yemen, there are hardly any protests. It's the sort of thing which the British public assume that that's somehow things that we do and hope that the government have got it right this time. It doesn't always get it right. So I'm not sure that your characterization of me thinking wistfully would work, really. I think we're in a completely different nation state with an utterly different set of assumptions and traditions and stories that we tell ourselves. And they are utterly different to the stories which the Swiss tell themselves. Just to give you one tiny example, in virtually every Swiss house, there is a machine gun with plenty of ammunition. Everybody who has been a conscript has the right to carry a rifle and stores it, and it's part of citizens' defense. And every year, an able-bodied man will spend some days reminding themselves about what it is to be a soldier. There is no history whatsoever of the misuse of that freely available plethora of automatic rifles across the whole of Switzerland, and something which we would not tolerate at all. But it has to do with the stories they tell themselves about being autonomous, independent, different, self-reliant, resilient. We don't think of ourselves like that at all. We have different stories that we tell ourselves. The British narrative is nothing like the Swiss. And without that narrative, you wouldn't get the International Committee of the Red Cross being created in London.
Thank you, Peter. Dave and then Katie. Go ahead, Dave.
Peter, early on in your talk, you mentioned the Red Cross running prisoner of war camps, I believe.
Yep.
I mean, correct me if I've got that wrong. But was that the last time that was ever done? I don't recall it ever happening again.
I'm just thinking about the wars since then. The prisoner of war camps that the British ran in the Boer War were all run by the British. In the Spanish-American War, 1898, that was what President Roosevelt at the time called a splendid little war, not a phrase that would sit comfortably with this particular audience, but that was over so quickly there was no time for prisoners of war. So by the time you get to the First World War, prisoners of war were national responsibilities, but served by the Red Cross, as in the Second World War on all sides. So no, I think the prisoner of war, the protection and sustenance of prisoners of war was something that is fairly, I think, is unique to the war of Franco-Prussian War. So no, I don't think that was repeated again.
Thank you, Katie.
Just to go back to the Swiss having guns in their homes, yes, they're all issued with guns when they do their national service. But a friend of ours told me that for people living in cities, it's now possible to leave your gun at a locked up gun club rather than actually keeping it in your house if you haven't got a safe place to keep it these days.
Yeah.
Although I expect country people still have it in their homes.
They certainly do. But your correction of me, as in all things, Katie, is entirely welcome.
Yeah, I do have a number of Swiss colleagues, as it happens, and when I go into their houses or flats, then it's very clear that the way that a Swiss building is constructed, it always has a fallout shelter, call it, in the basement, which isn't built as a fallout shelter. It's built as laundry room or gym or whatever. But yeah, there is 4 feet of concrete between that gym and laundry room, etc., and the rest of the building. So again, this is a mentality thing that they just completely accept. It doesn't mean that they're scared, It's just the way that they build their houses.
Actually, this is the moment that I've been waiting for years. I'm going to correct Sherd.
Hey.
Actually, they are built as bomb shelters. They happen to be used as
Yeah.
garages and laundries and storage places, but they're actually built. And the building requirements when you build a block of flats of the sort that Katie and I lived in, enforce on the builder and the architect the requirement to have a subterranean space that can, in an emergency, be supplied with running water, sewage facilities, and so on. And so it's part of the Swiss response to the nuclearized world that emerged after 1945. By the way, all of you should see Oppenheimer if you can. And as a way of demonstrating to the world that Swiss meant neutrality when they say neutrality, the bomb shelters are meant to signal to the Swiss that if nuclear war does break out in Europe, Swiss citizens are going to be as safe as it is possible to be in that environment. Again, when you think of the collapse of the 1950s civil defense regime in this country, again, it's a completely different story that we tell ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. No, I did mean, in fact, that they are built as bomb shelters, but they don't make them look like bomb shelters. They then repurpose them, and you know, they look like gyms, and they are incredibly well lit. So and again, it's something that they totally take for granted. That
you can tell they are bomb shelters,
Yeah.
Sherd, if you look at the metal doors.
Yeah, huge, absolutely.
They're huge. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so maybe I can squeeze one in. We only have a few minutes left. We always let our speakers escape at 9 o'clock at the very latest. But this Bourbaki panorama, Peter, fascinating that they moved it, and I've never heard of it. But are you suggesting that anyone and everyone in Switzerland knows about this Bourbaki panorama and is proud of it?
No, I can't assure you of that. I don't know that.
Right.
Lucerne has a number of transport museums. It's got a very good car museum and a train museum, and this.
Yeah.
Right.
But what should maybe reaching towards? I mean, if you take the German Reichstag building, every school child in Germany historically since 1945 has been required to make a visit to Berlin and to look into the abyss that once was there and to be reminded never again. There is no such requirement, so far as I'm aware, to process Swiss school children through the Bourbaki panorama in that kind of nation building, storytelling reinforcement in that way. But it was certainly a political act to move it from French-speaking to German-speaking Switzerland. And it is a very popular tourist destination in Lucerne, which is full of wonderful things to see. Perhaps you'll forgive me can I just share screen again briefly?
Yeah, do.
Because when I was looking through my Swiss photographs and so on, I did come across something which will make you really all very envious indeed. And you need to see it.
I'm sure that's one of the 7 mortal sins, isn't it, Peter?
I don't know.
To generate envy in others.
This is there are 3 views from our flat, our apartment in Geneva. This is looking over to Mont Blanc. That's an early morning site. That's an evening site. And that's another evening site.
That's a young
So we miss Geneva quite a lot.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's lovely. We have just a few more minutes left for a few last questions. Bruce. Go ahead, Bruce.
What struck me about the time of the Franco-Prussian War was it was at a time when Britain and Prussia were starting to talk to each other. It was a time when Victoria was the empress basically of most of the world. I'm surprised, seeing as the Crown Prince of Prussia was sitting in Versailles for most of the war, and he was Victoria's grandson, that Britain didn't get involved. It was very close. I mean, basically, we have Britain or England, whatever, have German royalty. Even Charles today has got plenty of German blood in him.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I was surprised that they didn't get involved. And if they had have got involved, how the world might have changed when where Marx and Engels were shot down and didn't get taken up in Western Europe, and got taken up by the Bolsheviks disastrously. It's just amazing how something that happens very, very quickly, because the decision that the French made to declare war on Germany apparently was quite quick.
It was, but I think counterfactuals are always fascinating. I don't think that we can blame Britain, which is responsible for many, many things having gone wrong, not least
Now,
some
what
things in the Middle East.
guilty.
But the idea that we might have been responsible because we didn't go in on the French side and therefore Marx and Engels wouldn't have had earplay, I don't think we could have got that. I don't think we need go there. But I think the reason why England, the United Kingdom, Britain didn't get involved despite monarchical connections with the royal house of Prussia was, first of all, that Bismarck had diplomatically isolated the French from all possible assistance in time of war. So the friendly relations between Prussia and Britain were part of that process. As long as no one came to France's aid, Prussia was entirely confident that it would win. It had more manpower, it had better industry, it used the telegraph and the railway more intelligently. The only thing that the French had in their favor was that they had a better rifle. They had worse artillery, they had poorer communications, worse logistics. And so the Prussians needed no help, as was demonstrated, in fact, by the war. They needed no help at all. The only difficulty was cracking the Parisian nut. So the British leadership at the time was under no pressure to join. And the relations between the British and the French over Crimea had been quite difficult anyway. So no, I don't think we would have ever have needed to have got involved, and we were not pressured to be involved.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, one of the paintings that you showed, I found absolutely fascinating. It was the British, I've forgotten his name, but there he was dressed in all his pomposity and about to give equal financial aid to both sides. And immediately we all think, well, I know what you're going to spend that on, mate. Well, isn't that bizarre that you're giving financial aid to both sides?
I mean, I don't know with what strings. I don't know what strings were attached to those things. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, if you're providing doctors or bandages or whatever, then it's obvious that you are the Red Cross or that you are neutral.
As was shown in the other picture, we certainly did provide hard medical goods and food and so on.
Yeah.
But it is the case that he traveled around, the shuttled between the forces and provided aid in monetary aid. Now, I'm quite sure that he would have thought, like you should, what are they going to spend this money on? But obviously that did not stop him from dispersing millions of pounds. I don't think, by the way, that that would have aided the war effort, simply because it took hardly any length of time at all. It was over by November.
Yeah, thank you. Good people, we've reached our 9 o'clock mark almost. So, Peter, thanks ever so much for your time and all the work you've put into this. It's obviously a subject that's very fascinating to you, and you've been able to impart your love of this subject, or at least your understanding and knowledge about this subject, and given us an awful lot to think about. So thanks ever so much, Peter. Really appreciated.
It's okay. That's lovely.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, right. End of meeting, everyone. Thanks again, Peter.
Okay.
Stop recording.
Is that okay?
No.
Oh, it's longer than I expected.
Who said that?
Shot.
Sorry?
A parting shot.
Yeah, but who said
Was
it?
it Peter?
Yeah, I know.
Oh, I see. He was talking to Katie, probably.
Yeah.
And he hasn't closed his video, so we. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
End of. Bye.
Thank you.